The desert does not forgive. In the vast, open emptiness of Nevada, secrets linger longer than anywhere else. On a cold October morning in 1980, one of those secrets lay scattered along a lonely stretch of Highway 93, near a dusty arroyo outside Las Vegas. A truck driver had pulled to the side of the road, thinking he'd spotted discarded clothes tangled in the scrub. But as he drew closer, his breath caught. This wasn't cloth. It was flesh. It was hair. It was a young girl. The silence of the desert pressed against him as he staggered back. He fumbled for the CB radio in his cab, his voice trembling as he called in the nightmare he'd stumbled upon. Within the hour, sheriff's deputies arrived, their headlights sweeping the brush like spotlights on a stage that no one wanted to see. They crouched down in the cold dirt, studying the body of a teenager, slender, delicate, her life extinguished in violence. She had been brutalized. Her face bore the signs of blunt force trauma, her chest marked with stabbing wounds. There was no wallet, no purse, no license. No name. The only clues were on her body, her clothes, her jewelry, her silent injuries. To the officers, she was nothing more than another unsolved case. To the world, she was about to become a ghost. The desert winds carried whispers of cruelty that night. For some of the deputies, hardened by years on the job, this was just another body. But others felt something different, something haunting. A teenage girl dumped like trash. No one knew her story. No one even knew what to call her. Rumors spread quickly. In towns nearby, people speculated, was she a runaway hitchhiker who had trusted the wrong driver? A sex worker silenced by a client? Or maybe she was part of something bigger, something organized, something the authorities weren't ready to admit? The media gave her a name that would stick for decades, Arroyo Grande Jane Doe. It sounded clinical, almost sterile, a label that stripped away the person she once was. The decision to bury her under that alias sealed the tragedy with an extra layer of indignity. She had lived 17 short years, and now even in death, her identity was erased. But before the paperwork was stamped, before the coroner zipped her into a bag, before she became another unsolved homicide file, there was a moment of silence, a recognition. The medical examiner noted the precision of her killer's violence. The stabbings were frenzied, but the blunt force trauma, that suggested control. A familiarity. Whoever had done this hadn't lashed out randomly. Yet, the case was doomed from the start. No leads. No witnesses. No ID. Detectives canvassed motels, bus stations, diners, asking if anyone remembered a girl traveling alone. But this was Nevada in 1980, a place of constant transients, gamblers, drifters, dreamers, and liars. No one remembered. Or no one wanted to. For months, her story lingered in newspapers, a tragic footnote between crime reports and Las Vegas casino scandals. But as time dragged on, other bodies appeared, other cases took precedence. Arroyo Grande Jane Doe was quietly shelved, her file collecting dust in a metal drawer. Still, she refused to be forgotten. Every detective who opened her case file described the same feeling, unease. Something about her photographs, the black and white crime scene shots, the autopsy images, stayed with them. She was not like the others. This girl had a story. She had someone, somewhere, who had loved her. And yet, she was buried nameless. Her gravestone in a Nevada cemetery carried nothing but the cruelly impersonal words, Jane Doe. Died 1980. No birthday. No hometown. Just a question mark carved in stone. Behind closed doors, police whispered theories too scandalous to share publicly. Some suspected she had been involved with bikers, motorcycle gangs notorious for running drugs and women along the interstate. Others hinted at cartel activity spilling into Nevada from across the border. A few even dared to wonder if one of their own might have silenced her. After all, the violence in her killing was excessive, but the clean disposal of her body suggested a calculated knowledge of police response times. But none of those suspicions made it into official reports. Instead, Arroyo Grande Jane Doe drifted into obscurity. Families of missing girls called in, desperate to know if the body could be their daughter. But dental records and height measurements never quite lined up. Each call ended in disappointment, and the girl remained nameless. In the absence of answers, the case became a breeding ground for myths. Some swore her ghost haunted the desert highway, appearing in the rearview mirrors of truckers on lonely nights. Others told campfire stories about the murdered hitchhiker of Arroyo Grande. The line between fact and folklore blurred, but the one truth remained unchanged: a teenage girl had been murdered, and no one knew who she was. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, detectives rotated in and out of the case. Some added notes, some ignored it entirely. By the mid-90s, the case file was a relic, a time capsule of a failure. And yet, buried deep within it was the undeniable evidence: her DNA. At the time, it was useless. But the future had a way of making corpses speak again. 41 years would pass before the desert secret whispered its truth. 41 years before Arroyo Grande Jane Doe would become Tammy Corrine Terrell. And when her name was finally spoken again, it would unravel not only her own lost story but a scandalous web of failures, cover-ups, and unanswered questions. But in 1980, on that cold Nevada night, no one could have known. They only saw a nameless girl, buried under silence, her story cut short. What they did not realize was that the silence would not last forever. They buried her quickly. There was no family to sit in the front row, no mother to clutch tissues, no father to clench his fists in rage. Instead, the ceremony was brief, almost administrative. A few detectives stood in silence, hands in their coat pockets, shifting uncomfortably as the casket was lowered into the Nevada soil. The name on the death certificate read Jane Doe. The name etched into the grave marker would read Arroyo Grande Jane Doe. It was cruel in its finality. To be reduced to a geographic label and a number. To have lived 17 years only to be memorialized as unknown. The detectives didn't talk much about it, but some of them carried the weight home. One investigator later admitted he looked at his teenage daughter differently after that day, more protective, more afraid. Another detective confessed that every time he drove past Arroyo Grande Boulevard, he thought of her, the silent girl in the ground, waiting for someone to call her by her true name. But the community had no name to hold on to. And when there is no name, people invent their own. The rumor mill in Clark County churned. At diners, patrons whispered, maybe she was a runaway from California. That's why no one claimed her. Could have been a Vegas working girl. You know what happens to them. Bet you it's bikers. Those guys are always up to something. There was a kind of dark humor in how quickly blame shifted. Housewives blamed drifters, truckers blamed gamblers, gamblers blamed cops. One old man claimed he'd seen her ghost near the arroyo, waving down cars. Another swore the killing was a mob hit, her body dumped as a warning. What most people didn't say out loud, though, was the quiet fear that her killer might still be among them. For detectives, it was maddening. Without identification, every lead collapsed before it began. Missing person reports flooded in from other states, each one a possibility that raised their hopes before crushing them again. Parents sent in school photos of daughters gone missing, brown-haired, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, dark-eyed. All could have been her. All could have been someone else. Dental records ruled out some. Age estimates ruled out others. But none were a match. Every time the phone rang at the sheriff's office, a family somewhere out there was desperate for closure. And every time the answer was no, another household slipped deeper into grief. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that one of those families was Tammy Corrine Terrell's. The investigation, already fragile, began to crack. Some deputies suspected the department wasn't doing enough. A few muttered under their breath that the sheriff's office was more interested in keeping up appearances than chasing real leads. After all, Las Vegas in 1980 was trying to build a glitzy image: casinos, neon, tourists. A murdered teenager didn't exactly sell hotel rooms on the Strip. So, her case file was quietly pushed aside. Not closed, never closed, but left to gather dust. The official explanation was simple: no leads. The unofficial explanation was far darker: this case was inconvenient. In small-town Nevada, inconvenience had a way of becoming silence. And silence had a way of becoming scandal. Years passed. Each October, a few officers remembered her. Some left flowers at the grave. Others poured out whiskey on the dirt, a gesture of respect to the unknown. But to the wider community, she was fading into myth. The Jane Doe of Arroyo Grande became less a person and more a ghost story. But even ghosts can stir anger. In the late 80s, one local reporter published an article criticizing law enforcement for their failure to identify her. He accused the sheriff's office of being more concerned with slot machines and political donors than with the brutal death of a teenager. The article was buried quickly, almost as if the paper had been pressured. Rumors swirled that the sheriff had friends in high places who didn't want the story dredged up. The controversy grew in hushed circles. Some whispered that maybe she was identified back then, but the name was kept quiet because it would have led to someone powerful, someone untouchable. It was only a rumor, of course, but in the absence of answers, rumors thrive. Meanwhile, her grave sat silent in the Nevada sun. The marker weathered, the engraving faded. No flowers from family, no letters, no visits except from the occasional detective who couldn't shake her from his conscience. And yet, her presence lingered. Officers spoke of dreams where she appeared, standing wordlessly, asking only to be named. Hikers claimed to feel chills passing near the arroyo where she was found. Truckers swore the road at night carried an energy, as though the land itself remembered. The detectives who had been young in 1980 grew old, retired, moved away. The rookies who inherited the case file often rolled their eyes, another unsolvable Jane Doe. And yet, when they opened the folder and saw the black and white photographs, they fell silent. The brutality was undeniable. The youth of the victim was undeniable. And the injustice was undeniable. Still, the system let her down. DNA technology was in its infancy, the concept of genealogy databases unthinkable. Her blood samples and hair were stored in envelopes, sealed and forgotten in evidence lockers. The very tools that could one day free her from anonymity were decades away. So, year after year, the girl in the arroyo remained the nameless one. Buried without identity. Whispered about in coffee shops. Ignored in official reports. But the story was not finished. Because the one thing time cannot erase is truth. The desert had kept her secret, but science was learning how to force secrets out of silence. And though no one could have predicted it in the 1980s, her case would not only resurface but would ignite a firestorm of controversy and suspicion that would expose failures in law enforcement, questions about justice, and a chilling possibility that her killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. For now, though, in the 1980s, she was just a nameless girl in a nameless grave. Forgotten. Until the future came calling. The desert never forgets. What men buried, the earth kept. And though Arroyo Grande Jane Doe lay nameless in her grave through the 1980s and 1990s, the world was changing above her. Technology was racing ahead, quietly preparing to give her the voice that detectives, psychics, and rumor mills had never been able to provide. By the early 2000s, DNA was no longer a futuristic experiment. It was a weapon, one that could topple alibis, reopen cold cases, and shatter courtroom lies. Television glamorized it with CSI, making the public believe every crime could be solved in an hour with a swab and a microscope. Reality was slower, messier, and far more frustrating. Still, hope flickered for forgotten souls like Jane Doe. In 2003, her case file was pulled from storage as part of a statewide initiative to review unsolved homicides. Detectives sifted through yellowed reports, grainy photos, and brittle evidence bags. There it was, a few strands of hair, a blood sample, clothing scraps. At the time of her murder, these were little more than curiosities. Now, they were keys. The evidence was shipped to a state crime lab. A technician carefully opened the envelopes, gloves snapping tight, tweezers lifting fragments of a life once lived. They extracted DNA. It was partial, degraded, but still usable. A genetic fingerprint from beyond the grave. For detectives, it was like hearing a whisper from her after all these years, "I'm still here." But the system had limits. In 2003, CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, was in its infancy. The sample was entered. No matches. No suspects. No relatives. Just silence. And yet, this silence was different. It was no longer hopeless silence. It was waiting silence. The years dragged on. Detectives retired. Evidence was boxed again. But by the mid-2010s, forensic genealogy had begun reshaping everything. Cold cases once thought unsolvable were exploding open. The Golden State Killer, hunted for decades, was unmasked in 2018 through a cousin's DNA. Across the country, nameless victims were finally being identified. Families who had clung to photographs for 40 years suddenly received phone calls that began with the words, "We've identified your daughter. In Nevada, those whispers of possibility stirred once again. Detectives reopened Arroyo Grande Jane Doe's file, this time with fresh determination. They partnered with genealogical researchers, uploading her DNA into databases designed not to catch killers directly, but to find their relatives. This is where the controversy begins. For some, genetic genealogy is the miracle of modern science, the ability to turn family trees into roadmaps for justice. For others, it is a privacy nightmare. Critics warned of government overreach, of innocent people being dragged into police investigations simply because their cousin, twice removed, had spat into a tube for a genealogy kit. But for Jane Doe, those ethical debates were a luxury she did not have. She had been silent long enough. In 2019, the genealogists found a lead. Not a direct match, but faint connections, third cousins, fourth cousins, a web of DNA that hinted at a family in Arkansas and California. The process was painstaking. Each connection had to be researched, mapped, and verified. Hours turned into weeks, weeks into months. Investigators pored through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. She wasn't a faceless ghost anymore. She had parents. She had a home. She had a name buried somewhere in those records. And then, in 2021, the silence finally broke. The genealogical trail led to the Terrell family. A daughter had gone missing in 1980. She was just 17. Her name was Tammy Corrine Terrell. The match was confirmed. After 41 years, Arroyo Grande Jane Doe had been unmasked. When the news broke, it wasn't just another cold case solved. It was a resurrection. For the detectives, there was relief. For the genealogists, triumph. For Tammy's family, heartbreak mixed with closure. Her mother wept when she heard the news. For decades she had lived with questions, the kind that gnaw at a parent in the quiet hours of the night. Is she alive? Is she hurt? Does she think I abandoned her? Now she had answers. The cruelest answers, but answers nonetheless. The press reported it as a victory of science over silence. Headlines hailed the miracle of DNA, the marvel of technology. But beneath the celebration lurked uncomfortable questions. Why had it taken 4 decades for Tammy to be identified? Was it really just the limits of technology? Or had investigators in 1980 failed her from the very beginning? Some journalists asked why her case had been allowed to go cold so quickly, why the leads had dried up when so many possible connections were left unexplored. They wondered if police indifference, or even corruption, had played a role in burying her story. After all, this was Nevada in 1980, a state where organized crime had its hands in everything from casinos to local law enforcement. Had Tammy been overlooked because her murder was inconvenient? Because chasing her killer would have meant pulling on threads that powerful people wanted left untouched? It was speculation, yes. But speculation had teeth. And as Tammy's name returned to the headlines, those teeth sank into the legacy of law enforcement failures. For the first time in 41 years, the girl in the Arroyo was no longer a Jane Doe. She was Tammy, a daughter, a teenager, a human being. But identifying her was only the first step. Naming her did not name her killer. And now, with her identity restored, the real work, and the real controversy, began. Because if the technology of the 21st century could give her back her voice, it also raised a new and chilling question: who had silenced her in the first place? For 41 years, she had been a shadow, a nameless girl with no story, remembered only by the violence that ended her life. But in October 2021, the silence broke. Arroyo Grande Jane Doe was no more. She was Tammy Corrine Terrell. The announcement came first in the form of a press release, clinical and brief. But behind those dry words was a tidal wave of emotion. A family had been waiting for 4 decades to hear her name again. Tammy was born in 1963. She grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, a place better known for UFO lore than for the struggles of teenage girls. She wasn't extraordinary in the way headlines like to frame victims. She wasn't a pageant queen, a star athlete, or a perfect daughter. She was a real teenager. Messy, hopeful, rebellious. She loved music, laughed too loudly, and sometimes argued with her parents the way 17-year-olds do. Her friends remembered her as lively, funny, and sometimes impulsive. She wasn't immune to trouble. Like many kids in small towns, she dreamed of escape, of bigger places, brighter lights. Las Vegas shimmered in her imagination. To Tammy, it wasn't just casinos and slot machines, it was freedom. But freedom has sharp edges. In the weeks before her death, Tammy left home. Some reports say she was hitchhiking, others that she'd met someone older who promised adventure. No one knows exactly what drew her out onto the road, but what's certain is that she never made it back. Her family reported her missing in 1980. But missing persons reports in those years, especially for teenagers, often gathered dust. Police departments were overworked and underfunded, and runaway teens were dismissed as just that, runaways. "She'll come back," was the refrain parents often heard. For the Terrells, the words were daggers. Their daughter was gone, and no one was looking for her. And then, suddenly, in 2021, she was found. When the phone call came, Tammy's surviving family members struggled to process it. For decades, they had lived in limbo, the unbearable state of not knowing. Every birthday, every Christmas, every photograph in a drawer was a reminder of absence. And now, a stranger's voice on the other end of a phone told them the truth. Tammy had been dead the entire time, her body buried under a false name, her story erased by time. Her mother wept. Her siblings asked questions no one could answer. Was she scared? Did she suffer? Who did this to her? For detectives, the identification was a triumph. For the family, it was salt in an old wound. Closure is a word thrown around in press conferences, but in reality, closure never comes. Knowing what happened doesn't erase the pain. It sharpens it. The news spread quickly. Local papers ran her photograph side by side with the black and white images of Jane Doe. Two lives, the girl she was and the ghost she became, fused into one tragic narrative. But with the revelation of her name came uncomfortable truths. Tammy wasn't a stranger to the system. She had been reported missing. Her family had begged for help. And yet, somehow, she slipped through the cracks. The fact that she had remained unidentified for so long raised a painful question: was it incompetence or indifference? The controversy deepened when journalists dug into her disappearance. Some sources claimed law enforcement in New Mexico had dismissed her case outright, assuming she'd simply run away for good. Others suggested her file had been mishandled during a transition between jurisdictions. There were whispers of something darker, that her case might have been deliberately buried, her identity left unconfirmed because investigating her death would have pulled attention toward people in positions of power. It wasn't just a story about a murder anymore. It was about a system that had failed a teenage girl at every step. Detectives who worked her case in 2021 tried to focus on the positives, the miracle of her identification, the promise of new leads. But the public wasn't satisfied. In online forums, in coffee shops, in newspaper comment sections, people demanded answers. Why had no one connected the dots sooner? How many other families were still out there, waiting for their Jane Doe or John Doe to be given a name? And while the family grieved, the investigation was thrust back into motion. Now that Tammy had a name, detectives could retrace her last steps. Who had she traveled with? Who might have seen her alive in Nevada in 1980? Had she been preyed upon by a stranger, or betrayed by someone she trusted? This is where the story turned scandalous. One rumor suggested Tammy had fallen into the orbit of an older man before her death, someone charming, dangerous, and well-connected. Some locals even whispered that she may have been lured into a trafficking network operating along the highways between Nevada, Arizona, and California. If true, it meant her murder wasn't random, but part of something far larger, far uglier, and possibly still active. The idea horrified her family, but detectives couldn't dismiss it. Nevada in the 1980s had been a hotbed of organized crime, with biker gangs, pimps, and smugglers all carving out their territories. Tammy may have been just another teenager chasing freedom, but to predators, she was an opportunity. The return of her name did more than restore her humanity. It reawakened suspicion. Suddenly, people who thought the past was buried found themselves being asked questions again. Old alibis were revisited. Old leads re-examined. And with every step forward, one thing became clear: whoever had killed Tammy had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase her identity. Which begged the most disturbing question of all: was her anonymity a coincidence of circumstance, or was it the very point? For now, Tammy's family clung to the fragments of her memory, photographs, yearbook signatures, the stories her friends told. They wanted to remember her as she was before the desert claimed her, laughing, full of life, 17 and invincible. But the world would never forget her as she was found, alone, brutalized, nameless. Now, with her identity restored, the fight was no longer about, who is she? It was about, who killed her? And if the theories swirling in the shadows were true, the answer might not only solve a murder but also expose a scandal that had been festering in Nevada for over 40 years. With a name finally attached to the grave, detectives faced the next and most difficult question: who killed Tammy Corrine Terrell? The identification reopened every old lead, every rumor, every whisper that had once seemed too fragile to pursue. This wasn't just a case file anymore. This was a homicide with a face, a family, and now, public outrage pressing for answers. The first step was obvious: retrace her last known movements. Witness accounts were vague. Tammy had been hitchhiking, seen along the highways that connect New Mexico to Nevada. Some claimed she was traveling with an older man, others thought she had joined up with a small group of runaways. But no one could agree on the details. Her family insisted she wasn't reckless, just adventurous. But adventure, in the desert highways of 1980, could be fatal. Those stretches of asphalt were hunting grounds, lonely places where predators prowled with impunity. Detectives pulled the old reports, and buried inside were the whispers that had fueled speculation for decades. The first involved motorcycle gangs. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, Nevada's highways were dominated by biker clubs. Some were harmless brotherhoods of men riding for freedom, but others were violent syndicates tied to drugs, prostitution, and extortion. Several unsolved murders in the state had been loosely connected to gang rivalries, their victims either disappeared or found discarded in the desert. Tammy fit the profile of someone who could have crossed their path: young, alone, vulnerable. One retired detective swore he remembered chatter about Tammy being spotted at a gas station, talking to bikers just days before her death. The report was dismissed at the time: no names, no proof. But now, with her identity confirmed, that faint lead looked much more sinister. The second theory was darker still. Some investigators whispered about trafficking networks that had operated quietly along the Las Vegas corridor. Young girls were recruited, or kidnapped, and forced into sex work around casinos and truck stops. For some, it was a short-lived nightmare ending in escape. For others, it ended in silence. Could Tammy have been lured into such a network? The brutality of her murder suggested someone wanted to make a statement. The blunt force trauma was deliberate, almost staged. It wasn't just about killing, it was about silencing. But then came the most controversial suggestion of all: corruption within law enforcement itself. At least one journalist investigating the case in the late 1980s had hinted that police may have deliberately looked the other way. Las Vegas in 1980 was a city on the rise, desperate to shed its reputation as a mafia playground. A murdered teenager on the roadside threatened that image. One rumor even claimed that Tammy may have known something, seen something, that made her dangerous to powerful people. Her disappearance, and the convenient, unknown identity, may have served more than one purpose. Was that speculation too wild? Perhaps. But in cold cases, speculation is oxygen. And this case had been starved for air too long. Detectives in 2021 found themselves walking a tightrope. On one hand, they had to pursue these leads professionally, carefully, without letting conspiracy theories cloud their judgment. On the other, they couldn't ignore that something about this case did smell off. Why had it taken 41 years for her to be identified? Why had earlier investigators dismissed leads so quickly? And why, when other Jane Does in Nevada had been prioritized, had this one languished? The family had their own suspicions. Tammy's relatives wanted answers, not just about the killer, but about the decades of silence. They demanded to know why her missing persons report had apparently never been matched to her body, even though the timelines aligned. At a press conference, a reporter bluntly asked a detective, "Was this incompetence, or a cover-up?" The detective hesitated before giving the standard answer, "We are exploring every angle." But the hesitation spoke volumes. Public pressure intensified. Online forums buzzed with armchair detectives piecing together theories. Some claimed to know bikers from the era who bragged about a girl in Nevada. Others accused casino owners, mobsters, even local sheriffs of being involved. It was messy, speculative, scandalous, and impossible to ignore. Every theory circled back to the same chilling fact: Tammy hadn't just been murdered. She had been erased. And erasure takes effort. Investigators revisited every suspect interviewed in 1980. Truckers, bikers, drifters, anyone who had been questioned was suddenly back under the microscope. But 41 years had passed. Memories had faded. Many were dead. Those still alive were either uncooperative or claimed not to remember. One potential witness, a woman who had been a waitress in Las Vegas at the time, claimed Tammy had come into her diner with an older man, possibly in his 30s, days before she was killed. The waitress described him as charming but controlling, someone who kept a hand on Tammy's shoulder the whole time. She remembered Tammy seemed nervous, hesitant, but not defiant. If true, this sighting could have been the last time anyone saw her alive. But without a name, the older man remained a shadow. Theories branched and tangled like desert weeds. Was Tammy killed by a stranger who offered her a ride? Was she a victim of organized crime, silenced because she had seen too much? Or had she been betrayed by someone she trusted, a supposed protector who turned predator? The controversy thickened when a retired officer made a startling claim in a local interview: "We had a good idea who did it back then. But the higher-ups didn't want us digging too deep." The statement was quickly dismissed by the department as personal opinion. But once the words were out, they couldn't be erased. The scandalous possibility lingered: what if Tammy's case had never been cold at all? What if it had been deliberately frozen? For the Terrell family, these questions were unbearable. They had waited 4 decades for a name. Now, they faced the grim possibility that the truth of Tammy's death wasn't buried in the desert. It was buried in bureaucracy, corruption, and secrets that some people still didn't want unearthed. The detectives pressed on, determined to break through the fog. But as the leads grew murkier, one fact became chillingly clear: Tammy's killer, if still alive, had been hiding in plain sight all these years. Watching the case fade, confident the secret would stay buried. Until now. By 2021, the question wasn't just who killed Tammy Corrine Terrell. It was why had she been erased for so long? Theories had always floated around, whispered in bars, in dusty sheriff's offices, even at family kitchen tables. But with her identity finally restored, the whispers grew louder, sharper, and more dangerous. The official story was simple: Tammy was a teenage runaway who met the wrong stranger, was murdered, and left nameless because the technology of the time couldn't connect her body to her missing persons report. But the official story rarely satisfies. And in this case, the cracks were wide enough to swallow the truth whole. One possibility was chilling in its simplicity: Tammy knew her killer. The evidence fit. The blunt force trauma suggested rage, familiarity. The stabbing spoke of passion, personal violence, not just opportunistic murder. If Tammy had left New Mexico with an older man, as some witnesses suggested, perhaps that man was her killer. Someone she trusted, someone she believed would take her to freedom. Instead, he led her to the desert. Detectives in 2021 quietly revisited old leads, looking for men in their 30s or 40s who had ties to both New Mexico and Nevada. A handful of names surfaced. One had a criminal record for assaulting women. Another had been rumored to transport runaways between states. None were ever charged. But the possibility that Tammy's killer was a man who had charmed her, gained her trust, and then silenced her was too strong to ignore. Then came the darker theory, one that still divides investigators today: trafficking. Las Vegas in the late 1970s was a city with two faces. On the surface, neon lights, blackjack tables, rat pack glamour. Beneath, organized crime, biker gangs, drug pipelines, and prostitution rings feeding off the city's endless demand for vice. Girls like Tammy were easy prey. Young, naive, hungry for freedom. They could be lured with promises of jobs, parties, money. Once trapped, they were disposable commodities. Some investigators believe Tammy may have been caught in such a network. The violence of her death, the brutality, suggested not only silencing but punishment. In the underworld, betrayal, or even perceived betrayal, was met with theatrical cruelty. Her body, left out in the open, could have been a warning. If this was true, Tammy's anonymity wasn't just an accident of technology. It was deliberate. A Jane Doe with no name, no identity, was easier to bury. Easier to forget. But it was the third possibility that sparked the most scandal, the one even seasoned detectives hesitated to say out loud. Tammy's case may have been buried because of corruption. Las Vegas in 1980 was a city in transition, desperate to scrub away its reputation as a mafia stronghold. Politicians promised reform. Law enforcement wanted to project competence, control, safety. And then, a teenage girl turned up murdered in the desert. Not just murdered, brutalized. Stabbed. Beaten. If her killer had connections, whether to organized crime, law enforcement, or local officials, then burying her identity wasn't just convenient. It was necessary. One retired officer, speaking anonymously, claimed he'd heard whispers back then that the investigation was quietly discouraged. He stopped short of naming names but implied that digging too deeply would have stepped on the wrong toes. What if Tammy hadn't simply fallen into the wrong hands? What if she had seen something, heard something, that made her dangerous to men with power? Maybe she was in the wrong motel room, overhearing deals between bikers and casino middlemen. Maybe she saw the wrong car pull up, recognized the wrong face. Maybe she was never meant to live past that night. To the public, such theories are irresistible. They turn tragedy into conspiracy, crime into scandal. And for Tammy, they offered a new frame, not just a victim of chance, but a victim of a system built to protect everyone but her. Her family, however, hated the theories. They wanted justice, not speculation. But they couldn't ignore the questions either. If Tammy's identity had been known in 1980, would her killer already be in prison? Had someone, somewhere, deliberately let her slip through the cracks? And if so, why? The possibilities swirled like desert dust. Some detectives leaned toward the trafficking theory, pointing to similar murders along interstate highways in that era. Others leaned toward the personal theory, convinced that Tammy's killer was someone she knew, a single man with rage and control issues. But for the public, it was the corruption theory that caught fire. After all, Las Vegas has always thrived on secrets, on cover-ups, on making inconvenient people disappear. Tammy, in that narrative, wasn't just unlucky, she was silenced. In online forums, amateur sleuths traded names of mobsters, bikers, even retired officers who could have been involved. Was it dangerous speculation? Yes. But it reflected the deep mistrust that has surrounded the case since the beginning. And perhaps that mistrust isn't misplaced. Because even in 2021, even with Tammy's name restored, the investigation into her killer felt oddly restrained. Detectives promised they were pursuing leads, but few details emerged. No suspects were named. No arrests were made. It left a sour taste. If modern forensics could resurrect her name, why couldn't it resurrect the truth about her killer? Unless, of course, the truth was still inconvenient. The scandalous possibility lingers like a desert ghost, that Tammy Corrine Terrell was never just a runaway who met the wrong stranger. That her murder wasn't random. That the reason she remained nameless for 41 years was not simply a lack of technology, but the presence of something far more human, far more sinister, willful silence. The dark possibilities hang over the case like storm clouds. And as her family clings to the hope of justice, the rest of us are left to wonder, who, exactly, wanted Tammy gone? And who, for 4 decades, wanted her forgotten? When Tammy Corrine Terrell's name was finally restored in 2021, her family clung to the hope that justice would follow. For 4 decades they had lived with a question mark, an unmarked absence at every holiday table, every family milestone. Now, with the mystery of identity solved, they wanted the only thing left, accountability. But justice, as it turned out, was not so easily resurrected. The truth was cruel. In cases this old, time itself is the greatest accomplice to murder. Witnesses die, suspects vanish, memories fade. Evidence, if it even survives, sits gathering dust in cardboard boxes. Files yellow. Tape degrades. A knife that might once have yielded fingerprints becomes a rusted scrap. Detectives assured the Terrell family they were doing everything possible. Forensic testing had advanced, yes, but only if the evidence had been preserved. In Tammy's case, what remained was frustratingly thin. The cause of death was clear, blunt force trauma and stabbing. But the murder weapon had never been found. DNA, if collected, had degraded in the desert heat. And the case file was riddled with gaps, as if pieces of the puzzle had been misplaced, or perhaps never documented in the first place. For Tammy's sisters, that felt like betrayal. If she had been found today, one said in an interview, she would have been identified in weeks, maybe days. But because it was 1980, they just let her go nameless. How do you forgive that? The question resonated with the public. Identification wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a reckoning. At community meetings, some locals demanded to know why her missing persons report had never matched her unidentified body. How could a teenage girl vanish in New Mexico and reappear dead in Nevada, yet nobody connected the dots? Was it laziness? Lack of resources? Or something darker, as rumors suggested? Law enforcement officials tried to explain. In 1980, there was no centralized missing persons database. No DNA testing. No internet to share photos or records. Cases depended on phone calls, faxes, and sheer persistence. But the explanations rang hollow to a public that had seen other cold cases solved, other Jane Does identified sooner. The Terrell family began to wonder aloud whether Tammy had been a priority at all. Had she been dismissed as just another runaway? Had her young age, her lack of money or influence, made her easier to forget? The idea that her case had been deprioritized because of who she was, not just what had happened to her, was devastating. And yet, despite the failures, there was progress. Detectives used genealogical DNA, the same tool that had caught the Golden State Killer, to finally identify Tammy. Could the same technology lead to her killer? Theoretically, yes. But it would require preserved evidence from the crime scene, blood, hair, skin cells. And whether that evidence still existed in usable form was an open question. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted they were fighting the clock. Every year that passed, another potential suspect died. If Tammy's killer was in his 30s or 40s in 1980, he would now be in his 70s or 80s, if still alive. Some believed he might have been incarcerated for other crimes, his name already buried in prison records. Others feared he had lived a full, unpunished life, raising a family, celebrating birthdays, all while Tammy's bones lay in an unmarked grave. The injustice of that possibility ignited outrage. In online forums, people posted bitter comments. Her killer has probably lived free longer than she ever lived at all. Another wrote, "Justice delayed this long isn't justice. It's denial." Yet even amidst despair, there were sparks of hope. Cold cases have been solved with less. A cigarette butt, a single hair, a forgotten fingerprint on a box of matches, any one of these could crack the case wide open. If Tammy's killer ever left even the faintest trace, science might still expose him. But the bigger question was this: would the system allow it? Because even now, controversy clung to Tammy's story. Too many gaps. Too many whispers of mishandled evidence, of files going missing, of early leads buried before they had a chance to breathe. Could the same system that had failed to identify her for 41 years truly be trusted to deliver justice now? The Terrell family refused to give up. They gave interviews, pushed for updates, demanded transparency. "We won't let her fade again," one sister told a reporter. "If they think we'll sit quietly for another 40 years, they're wrong." Her words hit hard, especially for a public increasingly distrustful of authority. To many, Tammy's case was more than a murder mystery, it was a symbol of systemic neglect, a reminder of how easily the vulnerable are overlooked. And that symbolism carried a sting. Because if justice could be denied for Tammy, how many others, other Jane Does, other forgotten missing girls, were still buried under silence? As the case dragged on without an arrest, the phrase, "justice delayed, justice denied," became a kind of mantra among her supporters. It was a warning, a rallying cry, and a bitter truth all at once. Perhaps the most haunting question wasn't whether Tammy's killer would ever be caught. It was whether the system that had failed her in life, and in death, was even capable of redemption. The clock ticked, the desert kept its secrets, and Tammy's killer, wherever he was, had enjoyed more freedom than she ever did. And maybe that was the most controversial truth of all, that justice, no matter how hard we chase it, can sometimes come too late. The Nevada desert doesn't give up its secrets easily. For 41 years, the wind swept across the Arroyo Grande wash, brushing over the place where a young girl's body had been discarded. Drivers sped past on the highway, never knowing a ghost lay waiting in the sand. That ghost was Tammy Corrine Terrell. In 1980, she was a teenager with dreams bigger than her hometown in New Mexico. She wanted freedom, music, adventure. What she found instead was betrayal, violence, and silence. For decades, she was remembered only as Arroyo Grande Jane Doe, a name as dry and impersonal as the desert itself. Her identification in 2021 was a triumph of science, of persistence, of human compassion. But it was also an indictment, a reminder of how long she had been denied her identity, her dignity, and her justice. Her story is now told in chapters: the hopeful runaway, the brutal murder, the nameless Jane Doe, the technological miracle that gave her back her name. But the final chapter, the one about justice, remains unwritten. And perhaps that's why Tammy still feels like a ghost. Because while her bones were found, her killer remains hidden. While her name was restored, her story is still incomplete. And while her family finally knows where she rests, they do not know who put her there. The controversy lingers. Was Tammy's case simply the victim of bad timing, an era without databases, without DNA, without the internet? Or was there something darker, something more deliberate, in the way her case was handled? Theories continue to swirl. That she was murdered by someone she trusted, an older man who charmed her before turning violent. That she was caught in the gears of trafficking, punished for resisting or attempting escape. That her silence was convenient for powerful men, and her anonymity was no accident at all. Each theory keeps her alive in the public imagination. Each one forces us to ask uncomfortable questions, not just about Tammy, but about the system that failed her. And here's the most unsettling part: Tammy's case is not unique. Across the United States, thousands of Jane Does remain unidentified, thousands of families still waiting for the phone call that finally gives them answers. Tammy is both a symbol of hope, that science can bring names back to the nameless, and a warning of how easily a life can slip through the cracks when the system looks away. Her family, though grateful for her identification, knows this too well. "We lost 41 years, her sister said. "We don't want another 40 years before we know who killed her." But the harsh reality is that time is running out. If Tammy's killer was in his 30s or 40s in 1980, he is now in his 70s or 80s, if he is even still alive. Every day without justice is another day closer to the possibility that he will die free, unpunished, unrepentant. And maybe that's what makes Tammy's story so haunting. Because in the silence of unanswered questions, one possibility becomes harder to ignore: that justice may never come. That thought is unbearable. And yet, it is real. But perhaps Tammy's legacy is not measured only in the arrest of a killer. Perhaps it lies in the questions she forces us to ask. Why do so many missing girls go unnamed? Why do some cases receive national headlines while others gather dust? Who gets remembered, and who gets forgotten? Tammy was forgotten once. She cannot be forgotten again. Her story is scandalous not only for the brutality of her death, but for the negligence, the delays, and the possibility that her anonymity served more than just fate, it served convenience. She forces us to look into the desert and see not emptiness, but the weight of every unanswered story buried there. And here's where the ghost of Tammy Corrine Terrell still walks. On lonely highways. In the shadows of Las Vegas. In the silence of case files marked, closed, unsolved. Maybe her killer is gone, his secrets buried with him. Maybe he sits somewhere today, old and gray, knowing the world has forgotten his crime. Or maybe he's still out there, blending in, carrying the confidence of a man who believes he got away with murder. But Tammy's ghost is a stubborn one. And ghosts have a way of demanding to be heard. In the end, her story is not just about murder. It is about erasure and resurrection. It is about how easily a life can be taken, and how fiercely memory fights to bring it back. The desert may keep its secrets, but Tammy Corrine Terrell is no longer one of them. And as long as her story is told, as long as her name is spoken, she remains more powerful than the silence that once surrounded her. Justice may be delayed. It may even be denied. But Tammy, the ghost in the desert, will not be forgotten again.